Hey everybody, welcome to week 7 of church history. This week we are picking up after the legalization of Christianity and sort of looking at the aftermath of freedom. And as you can see there on the PowerPoint slide, you've got a pretty elaborate church building. One of the things that we'll talk about as part of the aftermath of freedom is the increase in terms of not just church buildings, but especially more elaborate church buildings, which some are going to, depending on who you're looking at, some Christians respond to this in a positive light, some respond to it in a more negative light. But the way that it's going to work for this week, this lecture video, the first lecture video, is going to be covered on your week 7 quiz. The other 2 lecture videos are actually going to be covered on the midterm. And I'll explain more about how the midterm will look on Wednesday night during conference. But for this purposes, it'll be just this lecture video that'll be covered on the week 7 quiz. And the way the lecture is going to work this week, we again looking at really 3 different things, maybe two main things that are that the first part's broken down into 2 sections, and then the third sort of being an overview of the era. So first we're going to talk about how, depending on the person you're looking at and maybe the group of Christians, the legalization of Christianity is both a good and a bad thing, and it depends on who you look at. There's some that are going to look at the legalization of Christianity in a good light, and we're going to focus on the perspective of 2 rather important figures at the time, Eusebius and Augustine, and that'll be the first lecture video looking at both of those individuals. And the second lecture video will talk about a group of Christians that sort of are a schismatic or what we're deemed to be a heretical group by most mainstream Christians in the form of the Donatists. And then we're going to talk about monastics or people that live in monasteries, because that's going to be sort of the opposite reaction to maybe Eusebius and Augustine. And that'll be the first 2 lecture videos. The final lecture video for this week is going to talk about essentially the decline and fall of the Western Roman Empire and sort of give an overview of that. Last week we talked about Julian, who took over after Constantine's sons died. Again, Julian was Constantine's son-in-law. We'll pick up with him and essentially illustrate for about the next 120 years what happens in the Roman Empire and essentially what leads to its demise, because that is important, as we'll see, when it comes to the rise of the Bishop of Rome becoming and really operating in the sense of Pope that we sort of understand him to operate in, at least today. So again, the aftermath of freedom. Let's talk about the first perspective in this lecture video. And I do want to begin by way of just reminding ourselves maybe a little bit of an introduction to where we're at. We know that with Constantine legalizing Christianity, essentially we've got a new era of Christianity that is underway. We keep in mind that really Christianity had been born during persecution. It was born during the possibility of persecution, whether that was there in the beginning and middle stages of the 1st century with persecution from Judaism, whether it's the latter half of the 1st century towards really up to where we're at in this point in class with persecution coming down from the various Roman emperors and maybe some Roman officials. Christianity had been born in an environment where persecution was really a reality, an expected reality for a Christian at the time. But now things have changed, right? Christians are no longer going to, for the most part, there's some exceptions, but what comes from Constantine is an expectation that Christians are going to, in a sense, be protected by the government. They're going to receive a lot of blessings from the government in terms of liberties, in terms of financial support, in terms of even protection from outsiders and things like that. And so what comes of this is that we've got a new era for Christians, and they're going to have to adjust to it. And this is going to, for better or for worse, depending on who we look at, we're going to look at different perspectives. This is going to impact Christianity in either a positive or a negative way. And so really our discussion centers around how are Christians going to respond to this freedom. because, you know, for us as Americans, we simply see freedom as a very good thing, and it is a good thing in terms of, you know, having the freedom to, you know, do what you want in terms of religion, having the freedom to, you know, practice the religion that you desire. For us as Christians to be able to practice New Testament Christianity, that's a freedom that we enjoy and we don't want to take for granted. And so we naturally have a very positive outlook about freedom, because part of being an American is certainly an emphasis on limited government for a lot of Americans, and on the idea of freedom. But not everybody sees freedom necessarily in quite as positive of a light, because there are some that look at freedom and this change in terms of Christians' perspective and relationship with the government as a moment where Christianity can be altered and changed dramatically. And this change could lead to some things that are not so positive in nature. And that'll be a lot of who we look at again in the second lecture video. And so we really need to focus on how Christians respond to freedom, because it's not so simple as we might think. So we begin by talking about Eusebius, and we keep in mind that a lot of writings at the time come from, a lot of the writings of Christians come from important men, and we maybe can get a sense of maybe how some Christians, at least in a general sense, felt by the writings of maybe Eusebius and Augustine. Nevertheless, both of these individuals are going to have a very positive light of the freedom or the legalization of Christianity that Constantine in part has brought. So let's talk about him as a man. He was born around 260 AD in Palestine. In fact, he spent most of his life in Caesarea and eventually worked up his way to become the bishop of the church there. And like many of the other bishops, Eusebius is a man that becomes well trained. And he studies under a man named Pamphilus, who was also in the city. In fact, when you think about Eusebius would often refer to himself as not just Eusebius of Caesarea, which is where he lived most of his life, but he'd also call himself Eusebius of Pamphilus. That was just to show how much Eusebius thought of Pamphilus in terms of his training as an intellectual. Well, Pamphilus, part of his job was working with Origen's library that had been transferred from Alexandria up to Caesarea. And naturally, Pamphilus had help in terms of working on that library and organizing it and all that. And that was part of what Eusebius and some of other Pamphilus' students did. They aided him in the collection and handling of it. And for the most part, it's a pretty peaceful work until about 303 AD, when Diocletian's persecution begins to feel its effects in the city of Caesarea. In 303, you have the first record of persecution. But 4 years later, Pamphilus is going to be taken as prisoner for being a Christian. He's going to essentially sit in a prison for about 2 years. And after those 2 years, he is put to death by the authorities. And it's at this time he worked with Eusebius on an important work called The Defense of Origen. I'm not going to quiz you on that, but it may be helpful to know that work, because it's pretty much connected really with what Pamphilus was doing in the city, working with Origen's library. Eusebius, on the other hand, is not arrested at all, because there are at least 2 occasions where he is able to get out of the city for whatever reason it might be. He was not arrested. Maybe it was to avoid arrest. And, maybe some look at it sort of in the sense of, how Cyprian, for instance, we talked about him, how he tried to get away from persecution, and maybe some people looked down on him. Some people did look down on him for that. But there are also still, again, a significant number of people that believe that one didn't necessarily choose to be a martyr, but martyrdom was chosen by God. So, again, and we talked about it in the sense of the idea that, that some people frown upon the idea of you going up and just telling the Roman authorities you're a Christian and just offering yourself as a martyr on the spot. There's some people that frown on that. And it might have been that some in Caesarea frowned on that idea, so they didn't necessarily look at Eusebius in such a negative light as, say, those in Carthage did looking at Cyprian. Either case, Eusebius is not arrested. He's, in a sense, avoids that persecution to a large extent. Now, while he's away from the city, and this is where it's sort of fortunate for us, and really fortunate for any historian of Christianity, Eusebius actually completes the book, The Church History, which essentially is supposed to trace the history of Christianity from its beginning in the book of Acts up to really the 4th century. And one of the things that Eusebius is known by, in part because of this, he's called the father of church history because of his work. Again, this is a comprehensive work, and he gets that title from that. In fact, one historian talked about his importance, that without this work from Eusebius, he stated that without his knowledge, we would only have half of the history of early Christianity if we did not have Eusebius' work called The Church History. So that's a very important book. You want to make sure that you know that. We would only have 50% or half of a record of Christianity from its beginning up to the 4th century. We'd only have half of that if we did not have Eusebius' church history. So he's very important. He also, again, serves as bishop in Caesarea. And when he returns after this persecution is over, part of his job is to essentially regather the flock that he is in charge of as a bishop in the city. But again, at this point, the bishop is over regions as well, and so he's over the region of Palestine at the time. And and you think about this as probably a pretty difficult process because, again, persecution meant, scattering of Christians. You think about, right now dealing with COVID. My dad's an elder. I'm sure if you're not an elder, you probably know elders in your congregation or in the congregations around where you're at. But I know for elders, it's kind of hard to maybe keep up with every member of the congregation right now due to the COVID virus, because some maybe are not attending because of medical reasons or whatever may be. So essentially, Eusebius is sort of thrown into a tough spot in terms of regathering the flock. He's going to have to put his intellectual work, his writing, on hold because of it, because of that process. But he's also going to have a problem in terms of dealing with Arianism, which we talked about last week, and the Council of Nicaea. Eusebius was also one of the bishops that attended the Council of Nicaea, but for Eusebius, he had he placed an emphasis on the idea of peace and unity, especially throughout the church, and because of that, he sort of wavers on the idea of Arianism. At first, he's sort of inclined to agree with a lot of their points. When he gets to the Council of Nicaea and he sees that a larger portion of bishops are rejecting Arianism, he decides to rule against Arianism. But after that, he's going to sympathize with Arianism again, and because of this, he's going to really prolong Arianism's existence throughout the empire, because Eusebius is a man that is looked up to by a lot of Christians, again, being there in an important region in Palestine. So Eusebius would deal with Constantine on a couple of occasions. Again, first of all, it would begin, one of the main places where it would begin would be at Nicaea. Now, Constantine and Eusebius had met years earlier, when you keep in mind that Constantine had at one point been in both Diocletian and Galerius's court, who were rulers in the eastern portion of the Roman Empire, which would have included Palestine. So they met some years before the Council of Nicaea, but they maybe were more officially introduced at Nicaea, because now Constantine is the emperor. When the Council of Nicaea happened. And even though Eusebius might not have thought very highly of Constantine while he was serving under Diocletian and Galerius, who hated Christianity, he's got a very much more positive outlook on Constantine now, because Constantine has legalized Christianity, but you keep in mind that for Eusebius, he had watched his mentor, his teacher, die. He had watched some of his fellow colleagues die because of the persecution of Diocletian. And so in part a response would be a gratitude towards Constantine. And we're going to elaborate this on a little bit more. They meet at the Council of Nicaea, and they begin to form an important bond. They didn't always get to see each other directly. A lot of times communication probably came through letters, writing from one place to another, correspondence. Constantine, again, spent a lot of his time in the capital and traveling throughout the empire, whereas Eusebius was primarily located in Caesarea. So there's not a lot of occasions where they would have met frequently, but they do form an important bond. And one important moment, or notable moment we might say, of that is when they meet in Jerusalem at the dedication of the Holy Sepulchre, which again was the church that Constantine wanted to build on the tomb of Jesus. This also happened to be the 30th anniversary of Constantine's reign, so it was an important moment not just for Christianity, it was also a milestone moment for Constantine. And in that process, Eusebius is sort of the one in charge of organizing the event since he's the Bishop of Palestine, and he gives one of the main speeches at the dedication, and he essentially, to a relative degree, praises Constantine for what he has done in that speech. And so you can sort of see that they kind of get along with one another. And the importance of that bond comes from this fact that Constantine brought freedom in the form of the legalization of Christianity, but at the same time, Eusebius was admired by many Christians. So Constantine recognized that about Eusebius, his importance among Christians, at the same time that Eusebius is recognizing Constantine's importance because he's legalized Christianity. So it seems like they form a pretty important bond, at least in the mind of Eusebius. And it's actually going to be that once Constantine dies, that Eusebius would sing some of the greatest praises to Constantine. And no doubt Eusebius thought very highly of Constantine. And likewise, that affects his views on the idea of freedom that's provided by the legalization of Christianity. Constantine was one of those who noted that freedom brought forth what we might can call a golden moment in the history of Christianity. Again, freedom in a large sense was a phenomenal thing. It was a bright moment. It brought about a very important good for the church. And part of this was built on the idea that Eusebius had the mindset that it was going to come to a point where Rome would embrace Christianity. And in his mind, history was really pointing to Rome eventually embracing Christianity. Didn't necessarily know when it would be, but at least in Eusebius' mind, it does happen in his lifetime. You keep in mind that some of the earlier apologists that we talked about, like Justin Martyr and some of those men, talked about how Greco-Roman philosophy in the Old Testament were inadequate, and they all were pointing towards unity in Christ. And so what that idea was is that Christianity was sort of the culmination of human history. Everything pointed towards Christ. And I believe there's a class you can take at the school here at Northwest Florida School of Biblical Studies called the Scheme of Redemption. And in large part, the Bible does, the Old Testament, it's all pointing towards Christ. But for Eusebius, he also took this to mean that, all of these things that have happened also pointed towards Rome going from being the main persecutors of Christianity to become some of the most prominent proponents of Christianity. And this is the moment where essentially everything had worked together that was building towards this point, where the Roman Empire would embrace Christianity. And for Eusebius, the keystone moment when this happens is when Constantine is converted, which again happens at his death, which we talked about last week. According to Eusebius, the Roman authorities persecuted Christians because the Roman authorities believed that Christianity was not the pinnacle of Roman traditions. They didn't realize it at the time. Even though they saw Christianity, they didn't really see that everything that was happening was pointing towards these Roman authorities later on accepting Christianity. That is how Eusebius thought about it in his mind. Well, now not only has the church been liberated, that's a very important thing for Eusebius and other Christians, but now Rome has embraced Christianity. So this idea or this argument that Eusebius has formulated in his mind has come to pass. It has come to fruition because Rome has embraced Christianity by the emperor becoming a Christian. And with this freedom would bring a new perspective on things. Some things that Eusebius and some of these other Christians may not have thought about to a large degree in terms of the full intended after effects of what the legalization of Christianity brought. So we talk about freedom's new perspective on things. We keep in mind again that the gospel had been understood to be most persuasive to the poor. We've talked about that before, looking at the passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 1. Doesn't mean that rich people cannot become Christians, because you have definite examples of that in the New Testament. But we've talked about before again how, more than likely you've got a large portion of the church is made up of those that came from the lower middle class. And again, the rich often had difficulty in obeying the message, as evident by the rich young ruler and Jesus encounter in Matthew and Luke. And so this is going to change in large part because of the legalization of Christianity, which Eusebius maybe doesn't note right away. Keep in mind again that now Christians are going to sort of enjoy a new level of wealth that might not have been available in the couple centuries past. We talked about that with the Council of Nicaea, how Constantine essentially transformed this into sort of an elaborate and elegant meeting for these bishops. The food that they received, the lodging that they received, the travel that was provided for them, the gifts that was provided to them. All of these things are sort of new for a lot of Christians. This leads to an idea that riches and pomp and wealth begin to show divine favor from God. And Eusebius, of course, saw the benefits of that at the Council of Nicaea. And this is going to point towards now a greater emphasis on how what we might could call the earthly powerful began to rival the number of people that were what we could say earthly powerless in the church. People that had power in government and power and authority, they began to grow in number compared to those that were essentially powerless in terms of earthly power. And so this is all new. This is part of the consequences of the legalization of Christianity. This door is opened. You also see that elaborate nature come from the construction of new buildings. Constantine, in some cases, is paying out of the government's pocketbook to build these church buildings for Christians that are much more elaborate than the homes that they worshipped in. That maybe the larger homes were converted into unofficial church buildings. Also, you think about the catacombs, how at first they were built they were being built underground as a way to save money. Well, now you've got more elaborate buildings being built because of the legalization of Christianity, and this is new for Christians. This is part of the consequences of freedom, the results of freedom that develop. And in part, what happens with that is a shift in terms of materialism. Whereas more Christians maybe were not so focused on the material or the carnal things, the legalization of Christianity promotes the idea of a focus on materialism. The focus is being shifted from the spiritual to the carnal, because now more Christians have access to maybe a better life, a life without persecution, and a life with more, to a certain degree, maybe more a life that is more perspective of acquiring more wealth. We keep in mind again that the hope that Christianity provided was important for a Christian to navigate throughout life. But now hope is more so seen as just simply a ticket into heaven, we might say. Whereas before then, with Christians that did not have a lot of blessings, physical blessings in life, it still held that importance about, the hope of Christianity gets us a home in heaven with God, but also hope helped Christians cope with sort of being the outsiders in society when they were being persecuted. It helped Christians cope with the fact that they did not receive maybe the same physical blessings that non-Christians received. And so that perspective of hope is sort of lost because of the legalization of Christianity. And so this shift towards materialism is a powerful temptation for Christians to have to wrestle with. And we'll talk about, we'll elaborate a lot more on that in the second lecture video. But in light of all of the good that came from the legalization of Christianity, there are some concerns that arise. And it might have been the case that Eusebius and some of these other writers that are talking about the positive aspects of legalization, they may not be aware of all the consequences. Theology is going to begin to change. Doctrine begins to change. It's going to reflect more so the authority and the structure of the Roman Empire, we might could say, especially as we begin to talk about the rise of the Bishop of Rome becoming Pope, and then the church structure that is sort of established under the Pope. We'll talk about that later on. But all of that's going to come about in part because of Christianity being legalized throughout the Roman Empire. And in conjunction with that, church officials are going to see their power in society increase. They're not just going to be ruling over the congregation or shepherding the flock, but they're going to have more so a say in the political affairs in the region in which they govern. And so now you begin to see what we might think of as the church officials becoming the new aristocracy of the Roman Empire. They're becoming the new wealthy elite. And that maybe doesn't happen immediately, but it begins at this point, and it's really going to come to fruition again once Catholicism becomes one of the main, really becomes the head, it really becomes the main power in Europe a couple of centuries later. You also see, in part, the opposite side of this. Not only are Christians being benefited, but now the Roman government, again, is going to be given more power and leeway and ability to shape doctrine and theology. And again, we saw that in connection with Constantine and how he could call a council together and tell the bishops to essentially, decide on the matter. Well, this is going to continue. This precedent is going to continue, and that's in part because of Christianity looking positively on the Roman government because of the legalization of Christianity. And I may feel like I'm saying that over and over again, but that's an important concept to get in our mind. So let's move on and talk about Augustine. Now, Augustine has been called one of the greatest theologians in Christianity. And that doesn't mean that Augustine, everything that he said was correct, as we'll note in a moment. But there is no doubt that Augustine does leave a dramatic impact on the development. He does play a profound role on the development of and the changes in Christianity moving forward. He's also going to become an important figure in the Protestant Reformation movement, especially with John Calvin, which we may elaborate on that more in a minute, but we'll definitely talk about that in the class on the Protestant Reformation, which will be after this class. But Augustine's not the only church official, or what we might call the theologian, who benefits from this time. He's really one of many. And one of the things for Augustine and some of these other individuals is that now that you have freedom's going to sort of open the door for a greater invitation for more people, more educated men to study Christianity, because now you don't have to worry about being persecuted for it, for the most part. And again, Augustine's just one of many other individuals. There are others that are important. For instance, you have a scholar named Jerome, who is I believe one of the first Christians to translate the Bible from Greek to Latin, the Latin Vulgate. You may have heard of that translation of the Bible. Well, that's attributed back to a man named Jerome, who was a contemporary who lived at the same time as Augustine. And so he, like Augustine, is going to benefit, at least in part, from the legalization of Christianity. So let's talk about Augustine, the man. He's born in 354 in a region called Numidia. And I will pull up a map of this. And I want to pull up the sling and put the map as the large portion. So I'm not in the way. All right, so if you're looking, again, here's the Roman Empire. This is around 400 AD. Again, Eusebius, who lives a little bit before Augustus, he's primarily in this region right here, Caesarea being over here. This is Palestine. Augustine's born in North Africa in a place called Numidia. It's not labeled on the map. But again, here's Rome. Numidia is essentially this region right in here. Which again, Carthage, we've talked about it a lot. It's a little bit to the east. And Augustine's going to wind up moving from Numidia. He's going to become a bishop in the city of Hippo, which I believe this is Hippo, where Augustine becomes bishop on the coast of North Africa. So maybe looking at that map gives you an idea of where Augustine's at. He's on sort of the western portion of the North African coast on the Mediterranean Sea. And again, we pull up the PowerPoint. There we go. All right, so we look at it. He's from the city of Numidia. He comes from what we might call a spiritually broken home. And what I mean by that is sort of a home like what Timothy came from in Acts chapter 16. We keep in mind Timothy was born to an unbelieving husband, or an unbelieving father, whereas Timothy's mother was a Christian. And sort of the same idea here for Augustine. Augustine came from a home where his father was not religious at all. His mother is. His mother's a Christian. His father was more concerned about his intellectual advances, his intellectual development. And it's actually a friend of Augustine's father that pays for Augustine to become an intellectual, to train as a scholar. And he's going to study in Latin and rhetoric. And one of the things about Augustine, at least early on, is that he becomes a hearer of a religion called the religion of the Manichaeans. He actually becomes what's called a hearer of the Manichaeans. And the religion of the Manichaeans, it comes from Persia originally, but sort of like Gnosticism, it's not originally Christian in nature, but it sort of is ties itself in. It sort of has its own take on Christianity. And for a time, Augustine sort of followed it. He became what was called a hearer, and the hearer served the elect, or what were called the perfect, in that in their take on Christianity. And so one of the ways that worked is that, for instance, in the Manichaean religion, it was seen as a sin to harvest crops and to kill animals. And partly because, and we might understand the animals in terms of, like today you have vegetarians or vegans who, and I get those mixed up sometimes, so I apologize if I don't get this correct. There are those that refrain from eating meat or products that come from meat. We kind of understand that. But the Manichaeans, those that are in the elect, they viewed the idea of harvesting crops as a sin like the killing of animals, because you were killing the plants, which is sort of different from the way that we think that a lot of people look at it today. And so the elect could not do those things, right? So you think to yourself, well, how could people that are of the elect, in terms of the Manichaeans, how could they even eat if they can't even harvest plants? Well, that was the job of the hearers. The hearers would go and they would harvest the plants and provide for the elect. And since the hearers sinned, the elect would pray for the sins of the hearers so that the hearers would be forgiven of their sins. And so in that process, the elect could eat. And then the elect were responsible for praying for the sins of the hearers who destroyed plants, which the Manichaeans thought were a sin. And again, that's very different from, it's a very different concept for me, at least, maybe a very different concept for you in terms of some of the religious ideas maybe you've been exposed to. But this is sort of what Augustine was for about 10 years of his life. He was a hearer of the Manichaeans. And they were, again, a group that was similar to Gnosticism. They sort of believed in the idea that there are two very distinct entities in the universe. There's a constant good and a constant evil. They sort of held to the idea, again, that the body was evil, which we've already talked about, the response to Gnosticism. There were Christians that obviously argued against that. Augustine's not sure for a while, but he will eventually change on that position, as we'll note in a moment. So while this is sort of going on, he moves to Milan, and this is where he begins to read the Bible. Milan's a city in Italy, the northern part of Italy. And he's baptized in 384 AD as part of reading the Bible. And his mother eventually dies, and in part that leads him to want to start a monastery. But this does not work out for Augustine. Augustine's actually going to, because of his popularity as a scholar, people push him to become a priest, and then he's going to work his way up from being a priest all the way to being a bishop. And again, he becomes the bishop of the city of Hippo. So he deals with a lot of things, deals with a lot of different groups. Again, the Manichaeans are going to be one of them, but it's in part how he deals with some of these schismatic or these separatist groups of Christians that helps Augustine shape a more positive attitude towards the Roman government and the legalization of Christianity. So with the Manichaeans, it's really not, he doesn't have to deal too strongly with them in terms of getting the government involved. Before Augustine, he just simply responded to the Manichaeans, after being trained as a Christian a little bit more, came to the realization again that the body is not evil, but when the human will decides to perform evil works, or when man chooses evil, that's when problems arise. That's where sin happens, and he breaks away from the group in response to his further training. Now he's going to deal with a group of people called the Donatists, which I believe you might have already read about, but we're going to talk about them more as not necessarily their beliefs per se, but more so as it pertains to their view on the legalization of Christianity. We talk about that in the second video. But Augustine's views of unity. Augustine had a strong belief in unity, and this was a large part in contrast to Donatism, which sort of developed its own churches, developed its own structure, and was sort of a separatist group. Whereas Augustine, because to a certain degree tolerate people that didn't necessarily always think like him. The Donatists were very much mutually exclusive. They didn't really want to embrace the form of Christianity that Augustine promoted, and that was widely promoted throughout the Roman Empire. And so Augustine, in order to promote unity, to get rid of the Donatists and to promote unity, he looks to the Roman government as the enforcer of unity. And again, this all happens because Christianity has been legalized, and the Roman government is in favor of Christianity. This becomes a new resource for some Christians to fight against heresy. And the way that Augustine really portrays this is not so much that what we might think of as the Roman government persecuting what are thought to be heretics. It's more like the government is just simply practicing church discipline. And maybe that goes to show how involved Augustine thought that the Roman government could get with Christianity. That in order to punish the Donatists, this is really actually, you're not persecuting heretics, you're actually just practicing church discipline against people that need to straighten up. He also promotes this idea, and he's also pushing and reflects this idea that bishops could provide further rationale to the Roman authorities about how they can handle schismatic groups. So they're sort of beginning to work hand in hand. Augustine sort of views that in a positive light, which means that he's going to view the legalization of Christianity in a positive light. But it is important to note that Augustine did not want the powers, the church and the Roman government, to completely blend together and that they become one. He did want them to remain distinct, but he did want them to work hand in hand in terms of promoting the unity of Christianity and unity throughout the empire. He also writes a very important work called The City of God. And this is in part a response to Rome when the city is invaded in 410 AD, which we'll talk about in the third lecture video. There were some pagans that looked at this. There were pagans that still existed at the time. I mean, there's still what I might just say is there's still a considerable number of Roman citizens that are still practicing the Roman religion. Well, they look at this invasion and some of the turmoil that happens around the same time as the end result of Christianity. Now that the empire has abandoned the traditional gods, the gods are punishing the Roman Empire for embracing Christianity. And so what Augustine does in The City of God is really to try to defend Christianity from some of these accusations that are being rehashed and promoted as new against Christians once again. So Augustine wants to defend Christians and Christianity from some of these arguments. Again, you keep in mind that, with Eusebius' view of Roman Christ, Eusebius saw that as the end of human history. Augustine may not have felt quite as strongly as Eusebius on that point, but he does recognize that Rome's embrace of Christianity is something that is positive for the church. And he will sort of illustrate that in a way in this work. One of the main things that comes out in this book is that Augustine argues that there are two distinct cities that one is a part of. You are either a part of an earthly city alone, or you are also part of both an earthly city and a heavenly city. And one of the things that Augustine notes about that is that the earthly and the heavenly city are both working towards different ends. For Augustine, the earthly city, which is often reflective of the city of Rome, Rome is working towards peace in society, whereas the heavenly city, which is made up of essentially those who worship God, so not necessarily just the church, but also would include heaven itself, the angels and those that have already died, who, we know the day of judgment, those that are in paradise go to heaven, they worship God. It's portrayed in the book of Revelation. That's sort of the end goal of the heavenly city is peace with God and worshiping Him. And as Christians, they are a part of the heavenly city, but they do find themselves, while they're on earth, living in earthly cities. And so one of the things that Augustine tries to show in the book is that, the church recognizes this, but the church also can benefit the earthly city by having those goals in mind about what they want in terms of after the earthly life and some of those ideals. And so the City of God, again, is written as a defense of Christianity, and it in part promotes, again, the positive aspects of the legalization of Christianity. This is a better era for the Roman Empire because of Christianity's presence. And then finally, one of the last things that Augustine deals with, or one of the other major groups that Augustine has to deal with, comes from a group of Christians that follow a man named Pelagius. Now, Pelagius was a monk that was originally from Britain. He travels to Rome in 380 AD, and when he takes in the city, he doesn't like what he sees. And really, what he doesn't like in the city is, again, the immorality and the wickedness of the people. And Pelagius becomes pretty influential among some of the families in Rome, but he primarily wrote about how man can be good. And this was in contrast maybe to some that held to the idea that, since the city itself, a lot of the people are immoral, that's just the way people are. Pelagius had maybe a more optimistic outlook on it by stating that people can choose to be good. Well, Pelagius has a disciple named Celestius, and Celestius takes it a little bit further from Pelagius in terms of what he's teaching openly. And now this is where we'll point out that actually this group that was called heretical is actually more in line with what the teaching of the New Testament indicates. Celestis argued that humans begin their life unencumbered by sin. That is, that they are not born into sin. There is no such thing as an original sin. So sin is really a learned trait. It's not something, again, that somebody is born into. They learn what sin is because of their shortcomings and failures. And so when it came to Adam's sin only affected himself in terms of the spiritual consequences. And this sounds, really for us, it sounds really good in terms of what the New Testament teaches. But you have to keep in mind that at the time, you already had a lot of people in the Western Roman Empire that were practicing infant baptism, in part because of the idea that infants were born into sin. Well, this ran against Pelagius and Celestis ideas, run against a lot of church officials in the Western Roman Empire. And Augustine's going to respond to that. I will note that Pelagius would emphasize concerning the grace of God that part of his grace was that man was given the freedom of choice to do good. Now, Augustine didn't necessarily reject the idea of free will, but it did differ from what Pelagius viewed. So, in the response of Augustine, and I'll just go ahead and summarize this. You'll want to make sure that you take notes on this. I didn't get that included in the PowerPoint. For Augustine, he said that essentially Pelagius has too optimistic of a view of humanity. Again, that's just the idea that, Pelagius believes that man can choose to do good. Man's not born into sin. Well, Augustine thinks to a certain degree that's too optimistic of a view of humanity. For Augustine, he believed in the idea of original sin, and that infants would then need to be baptized. But he does acknowledge the idea of free will. But Augustine's idea of free will is that before you become a Christian, you only have the free will, you have freedom to choose sin, which sort of sounds contradictory, because how is it freedom if that's your only choice? Nevertheless, it seems that Augustine emphasized the idea that before you became a Christian, all you had was the freedom to sin. Whereas after you become a Christian, then you have the freedom to choose to sin or choose not to sin. Because now, at least for Augustine, who believed in original sin, Augustine felt that one has overcome that sin by being baptized. Whereas Pelagius, it appears, did not believe in original sin. Well, nonetheless, Augustine gets the Bishop of Rome to agree with him, and Pelagius has to move away. And Pelagius would actually find more support in the Eastern Roman Empire. And this begins to show how the Western and the Eastern portions of the Roman Empire, because of religion, are beginning to sort of separate. And this is going to be, again, a byproduct of the legalization of Christianity, that, again, the church is given more power, but at the same time, because not everybody's in agreement on doctrinal matters, the unity that was supposed to be, sort of coalescing together between the West and the East doesn't necessarily come to fruition as what some had thought what would happen. And again, we'll know more about that going forward, but we will go ahead and stop here because we are at the end of this first lecture video. Again, this is what's going to be covered on the first quiz this week. The second and third lecture video are going to be covered on the midterm exam, in part with all of the other quizzes, and I'll talk about that more on Wednesday night during our conference. Well, that being said, thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. If you have any questions about that, feel free to email me. If you can't make it for conference Wednesday night, I'll send out an announcement with all the details concerning the midterm exam. But thank